The night Kirk Douglas looked across Johnny Carson's desk at John Wayne and said the one thing no one in Hollywood had dared say to the most powerful man in American cinema. The studio went so quiet you could hear the overhead lights humming. Wayne's hand went to the desk, slowly, deliberately, the way a man's hand moves when every other part of him is making a different decision. Then he stood up, and for 9 seconds that felt like 9 years. Two of the most iconic figures in the history of American film faced each other across 4 feet of studio floor, while Johnny Carson rose from his own chair and 300 people in the audience forgot entirely how to breathe. What Kirk Douglas said in that moment had been building for 14 years. It had started on a film set in Rome in 1959, with a decision that changed American cinema forever. A decision that Wayne had spent 14 years calling an act of treason, and that Kirk Douglas had spent 14 years knowing was the most important thing he had ever done. Neither man had expected to have this out on national television. But then again, the most important confrontations rarely happen where anyone expects them. Before we go any further, I need to take 1 second for something important. I see in the comments every single week that viewers who have been with this channel for months did not realize they were not subscribed. If you watch these stories, please take 10 seconds right now to check. It is free. It costs you nothing. And it is the only thing that keeps us going. Thank you for being here. Now let us go back 14 years, to the decision that lit the fuse on the night that almost destroyed the Tonight Show stage. Because before there was a confrontation, there was a blacklist. And before there was a blacklist, there was fear. And before there was fear, there were 2 men who had looked at the same Hollywood and drawn completely opposite conclusions about what loyalty to America actually required. The Hollywood blacklist. 3 words that defined an era, destroyed careers, and divided the American entertainment industry along a fault line so deep that its tremors were still visible in 1974, still capable of bringing 2 legends to their feet in a television studio in Burbank, with the cameras rolling and millions watching. To understand what happened between John Wayne and Kirk Douglas on the Tonight Show stage, you have to understand what the blacklist actually was and what it cost the people who lived through it. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, began investigating alleged communist influence in the American film industry. The investigations produced a climate of fear so total that studios began refusing to employ writers, directors, and actors who were named as suspected communists or sympathizers, regardless of evidence, regardless of due process, regardless of the catastrophic impact on innocent people's careers and lives. More than 300 people in the film industry were blacklisted. Some left the country. Some worked under pseudonyms. Some never recovered. Some took their own lives. The blacklist was one of the darkest chapters in American cultural history. Systematic persecution conducted under the banner of patriotism by people who believed they were protecting the country and achieved nothing except the destruction of lives and the silencing of voices. John Wayne believed in the blacklist. Not passively, not reluctantly, not because he was carried along by the institutional momentum of the time. Actively, aggressively. Wayne was one of the founding members of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization formed specifically to assist HUAC in its investigations of Hollywood, to name names, to identify communists and communist sympathizers for the committee's consideration. He spoke publicly and without reservation in defense of what the committee was doing, called the blacklisted men and women traitors, and maintained these positions with the same certainty he brought to everything else in his public life. The absolute conviction of a man who had decided what America meant and was not going to be argued out of it. He was not a villain in his own story. He was a patriot in his own story. A man who believed he was defending something that mattered against people who wanted to destroy it. But the people whose careers and lives were destroyed by the list he supported did not experience him as a patriot. They experienced him as one of the mechanisms of their destruction. And Kirk Douglas experienced something else entirely. Kirk Douglas, born Isur Danielovich in Amsterdam, New York, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing, had a relationship with the American ideal, that was personal in ways Wayne's never was or could be. His father was an illiterate ragman. He grew up in genuine poverty, 7 children in a house without enough food, learning English as a second language, putting himself through school, and then through acting training on sheer will and extraordinary talent. When he became Kirk Douglas, when the son of Meyer and Bryna Danielovich became one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema, it meant something specific to him about what this country was capable of. And when he watched the blacklist destroy the careers of people he knew, people he respected, people who were being punished for their political beliefs rather than anything they had actually done, it meant something specific to him about what could happen to that country when fear was allowed to replace principle. He did not speak up immediately. Nobody did. Not in those years, because speaking up meant being named yourself, meant having your own career become the next one on the list. He waited, he bided his time. And in 1959, when he decided to produce the film that would become Spartacus, he made a decision that was either the bravest thing a major Hollywood figure had done in a decade, or, depending on your position, an act of deliberate provocation. He hired Dalton Trumbo. Trumbo was one of the most gifted screenwriters in Hollywood history, and one of the most famous members of the Hollywood 10, the group of writers and directors who had refused to cooperate with HUAC, been cited for contempt of Congress, and served prison sentences for their refusal. He had been blacklisted since 1947. He had been working under pseudonyms for years, winning Academy Awards that went to fictional names while he sat in the dark and kept working. Kirk Douglas hired him, gave him his real name in the credits, Dalton Trumbo. Not a pseudonym, not a ghost credit. His actual name, on screen, in one of the biggest Hollywood productions of the year. It broke the blacklist. Not immediately, not completely, but fundamentally. After Spartacus, the fiction that the list could be maintained became impossible to sustain. Kirk Douglas had used his position, his power, and his willingness to absorb whatever came at him to do something that everyone in the industry had been too afraid to do for over a decade. John Wayne called it treason. He said so publicly, in interviews, in conversations that became legend in Hollywood. He said Douglas had given aid and comfort to America's enemies. He said it with the same absolute conviction that characterized everything else he said in public. And Kirk Douglas, who had put everything on the line to do the right thing and had succeeded, who had put his real name to something he believed in, and had watched the blacklist begin to crack as a result, heard what Wayne was saying, and understood that whatever argument they were having was not going to resolve itself through normal channels. So it waited 14 years, until Johnny Carson booked them both on the same night in October of 1974, in what the production team genuinely believed was simply a conversation between two legends of American cinema, about the industry they had both shaped. What nobody on the production team knew was that they had just arranged the most explosive confrontation in the history of The Tonight Show. Wait, because what happened in the 22 minutes before Kirk Douglas said what he said is the part that explains everything about why, when he finally said it, it detonated the way it did. The Tonight Show taping on October 17, 1974, had begun with no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. John Wayne was 67 years old, still working, still carrying the specific physical authority that had defined his screen presence for 5 decades. Though his body had been through more than most people knew. The cancer surgery of 1964 had removed his entire left lung, a fact he had concealed from the public with the same fierce privacy he brought to all his genuine vulnerabilities. Because John Wayne's relationship with vulnerability was that it did not exist, or if it did not belong in public. He arrived at NBC Studios in his signature Western jacket. That unmistakable Stetson had tipped at the angle that had become as recognizable as any piece of iconography in American popular culture, and he moved through the building with the ease of a man entirely certain of his place in the world. He did not know that Kirk Douglas was there. The production team, with the particular carelessness that comes from not understanding the history they are navigating, had not mentioned to either man that the other was booked for the same broadcast. This was not strategy. This was simply the ordinary compartmentalization of a large television production. in which different guests and different segments are handled by different staff members who do not always share information. Kirk Douglas arrived 40 minutes after Wayne. He had his own interaction with the production staff, his own conversation in the green room, his own process for settling into the particular professional readiness that live television required. He was 63 years old, and in the absolute prime of his physical and professional authority. The jaw that had become one of the most parodied features in Hollywood still as defined as ever. The eyes that had made 3 decades of audiences believe whatever they needed to, believe still carrying the full force of a man who had fought for things and won and knew the difference between genuine victory and the appearance of it. He did not know Wayne was there. The first moment either man became aware of the other's presence was at the edge of the stage, when they were brought out together for the second segment of the show, and the look that passed between them in the 2 seconds before the cameras followed their entrance was witnessed by the stage manager and 2 members of the production crew, all of whom described it afterward in identical terms. They said it was not hostility. Not exactly. It was recognition, the specific recognition of 2 people who understand immediately that a situation has been arranged around them, that they did not arrange themselves, and who are processing in real time what that means and what they are going to do about it. Wayne extended his hand. Douglas shook it. Both men sat down. Carson welcomed them with the warmth he extended to everyone of their stature, and the conversation began. It was fine for 17 minutes. Both men talked about their careers, with the ease of professionals who have given thousands of interviews and know precisely how to be charming and forthcoming and completely in control of what they are actually saying. Wayne was funny, the dry humor that his audiences loved, the self-aware performance of the Wayne persona that he had perfected over decades. Douglas was sharp and precise, and told a story about the making of Spartacus that was funny and warm and entirely safe. The version of the story he had told in many interviews, the production anecdote rather than the political act. And then Johnny Carson, following a thread in the conversation about the early 1960s in Hollywood, asked a question that he had asked in some form many times before. A question about what that era had been like to work in, what the atmosphere of Hollywood in those years had felt like from the inside. He was not thinking about the blacklist specifically. He was thinking about the period generally, about what it had meant to be making films in the years when American cinema was at one of its peaks of creative ambition. He had no way of knowing that the most innocent question about the most general subject was about to become the opening that Kirk Douglas had not been looking for and was suddenly, in this room in front of these cameras, with this man sitting 2 feet to his left going to take. Kirk Douglas turned slightly in his chair, not toward the audience, not toward Carson, toward John Wayne. The cameras caught it. The movement was deliberate, the body language of a man who has decided, in the space between one breath and the next, that something is going to be said now that has not been said before. He said, "Mr. Carson, you asked what it was like to work in Hollywood in those years." He paused. It depended entirely on who you were, on what you were willing to do to other people in order to protect yourself. The studio audience laughed slightly, the automatic response to what they interpreted as the beginning of a Hollywood anecdote. But the floor manager, watching from the wings, described the quality of those first 2 sentences differently. He said that the way Douglas said them, the specific register and the specific direction of his body, told everyone near enough to see his face that this was not going to be an anecdote. Wayne had gone still beside him, not visibly, not in a way the audience caught, but Carson caught it. He had spent 13 years behind that desk watching people, and he caught it. And what he saw made him make an almost imperceptible decision to not redirect the conversation, to let what was beginning to happen continue to begin. Douglas said, "I made a decision in 1959 that some people in this industry considered the most important thing a major producer had done in a decade. Others considered it an act of provocation. Others called it treason." He looked directly at Wayne. "I would be interested," he said, "in what Duke would call it tonight." The studio went quiet, not the graduated quiet of an audience sensing a tonal shift, immediate, total 300 people who had been settled into the comfortable receptivity of an evening's entertainment, had just felt the floor change under them, and they had gone still with the animal awareness of people who understand, without being told that something real is happening. Wayne's face did not change, not the surface of it, but something in the area around his jaw tightened in the specific way that the people who had worked with him for decades recognized as the precursor to something. Carson said very carefully, "Duke." He did not ask a question. He simply said the name, the way you say a name when you want someone to know that you are watching them, and that you trust them to navigate the next few seconds. Wayne said, "I've said publicly what I think about what Douglas did." He said it without raising his voice. "I don't need to change my answer tonight, but this is the first time you've said it to me directly," Douglas replied, "sitting next to me, after all these years. Isn't it?" It was not a question. Wayne looked at him. "What do you want from this?" "Kirk, I want you to understand," Douglas said, his voice carrying the specific calm of a man who has rehearsed the emotional temperature of this conversation in his mind many times. "What it cost the people you helped put on that list, not the ones who left the country, not the ones who used pseudonyms and kept working, the ones who didn't survive it physically." Wayne's jaw moved. "You're saying that's on me?" "I'm saying some of it is," Douglas replied. "Some of it is on all of us who had power and used it the way we used it. But you had more power than most, and you used it in a specific direction, and people died." The last two words landed in the studio with the full weight of specific, unambiguous truth, not rhetorical, not abstract. People died. Names were attached to that fact. Careers destroyed, futures erased, people who had come up against a wall with no way over or through it, people who had made the only choice left to them. John Wayne stood up. He did it the way a large man stands up when something has bypassed all the professional conditioning that keeps public behavior calibrated and has gone directly to something more fundamental. The chair moved. His hand went to the desk, the large hand closing around the edge of the way you grip something when you are deciding whether to hold yourself in place or release yourself into whatever is about to happen. Kirk Douglas did not move. He sat in his chair and looked up at Wayne with the expression of a man who has said the true thing and is prepared to receive whatever comes next, who has been waiting long enough for this moment that the threat of it no longer frightens him. Carson was on his feet before anyone registered he had moved. The movement was fast, the specific trained alertness of a man who has spent 13 years managing the unpredictable in real time, and whose body had developed a response that preceded conscious decision. He was out from behind the desk and between the two men before Wayne had fully straightened. One hand raised in each direction, his expression not alarmed but absolutely certain. The expression of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, and is doing it without hesitation. He said one word. He said no, not loudly, not in the performative voice of a host managing a broadcast. The voice of a man addressing two people who are going to listen to him because the situation requires it. Wayne looked at Carson. The hand on the desk did not release. Douglas had not moved. The three of them existed in a triangle of absolute stillness for 7 seconds that the camera operators described afterward as the longest 7 seconds of their professional lives. The studio audience had not made a sound. Not a cough, not a shift, not the smallest collective breath. 300 people were witnessing something that had no script and no predetermined outcome, and they understood this, and they were giving it the full silence it required. Then Wayne sat down, slowly, the way a decision is made slowly when both options are still live. The hand left the desk. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the specific gesture of a man bringing himself back from somewhere. Carson returned to his chair. Not immediately. He stood for another moment, making sure the ground was solid before moving. He sat down. He looked at both men. He said quietly, "This is either the most important conversation this show has had, or it is going to be the worst mistake I have ever made as a host. And I have made some significant mistakes." The audience did not laugh, but something in the room changed at those words. Some pressure released. Some permission given for what came next to be what it needed to be rather than what a broadcast was supposed to be. Wayne was looking at the desk. After a long moment he said, without looking up, "How many?" "How many what?" Carson asked. "How many people," Wayne said, "that you're talking about?" That didn't make it. There was a quality in his voice that the audio engineers, listening through their headsets, described afterward as something they had never heard in John Wayne's voice in any interview or any film. Not grief exactly, but the adjacent thing. The thing that exists next to grief in people who have not given themselves permission for the grief itself. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There were at least 11 verified suicides among people on that list. 11 that we know were directly connected. There were more that were not officially connected, but that everyone who was in that world understood were connected." Wayne did not respond immediately. Douglas said, "I am not saying you did this alone. I am not saying you were the only person responsible. I am saying you were part of a machinery that produced this. And I think you know that, and I think you have known it for a long time. And I think that is part of why this conversation has never happened before tonight. That is not a small thing to know." Wayne's head turned. He looked at Douglas for the first time since sitting back down. The full direct look of one man examining another, to determine whether what is being said is true, in the way that only certain true things are true, which is not comfortably or conveniently, but with a weight that persists regardless of whether you acknowledge it. He said, "What do you want me to say?" Douglas said, "I want you to say what you actually think, not what John Wayne thinks. You." Wayne's jaw worked for a moment. Then he said something that nobody in that room, nobody watching at home, nobody who had followed John Wayne's career for 5 decades would have expected to hear from him. He said, "I think I was wrong about some of it." He said it quietly, without performance, without the full stop that would have made it sound like the end of a sentence he wanted to walk back. He said, "I think I was wrong about some of it. And I think some of what I was wrong about had consequences I told myself weren't connected to what I did. I don't know if I can account for that the way you're asking me to. But I've thought about it. I have thought about it." Douglas was quiet for a moment, that stretched long enough to hear the hum of the studio's overhead lights. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He took out a letter. It was not in an envelope. It was folded, creased, paper that had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. He held it for a moment without speaking. Then he set it on the desk, in the space between himself and Wayne. He said, "Dalton Trumbo wrote that to me a week after Spartacus was released. The week the reviews came in, the week it became clear that what we had done had worked, that the credit was going to hold, that the blacklist had a crack in it that wasn't going to be repaired." He looked at the letter, not at Wayne. "He wrote to me about the people who didn't make it to that point, the people who should have been there to see it and weren't. And he wrote something at the end of that letter that I have read more times than I can count, because I think it is the most important thing I have ever read about what justice actually means, and about what it costs and about who has to pay it." He looked at Wayne. "I have been carrying that letter for 14 years. I brought it here tonight because I thought, if there was ever a moment for it, it was this one." He did not push the letter across the desk. He left it where it was, in the space between them, and he let the decision of what happened to it next belong to Wayne. Carson had not spoken in over 3 minutes, which was, by the count of his production staff, one of the longest periods of silence he had maintained in the middle of a guest conversation in 13 years of hosting. He was watching the letter on the desk and the 2 men on either side of it with the expression of a man who understands that he is in the presence of something that has nothing to do with him and everything to do with the history of the country he has been entertaining for 2 decades. Wayne looked at the letter. He did not pick it up. He said, "What does it say?" At the end, Douglas said, "It says, the people who stood aside are not absolved by the people who stood up, but the people who stood up make it possible for the people who stood aside to someday understand what they stood aside from, and that is its own kind of mercy." The studio was silent for so long after Douglas finished speaking that the floor manager later said he had checked the studio monitors to make sure the broadcast had not cut to black. It had not. The cameras were still running. 300 people were still in their seats, and John Wayne, for the first time in a public setting in over 50 years of public life, sat without the armor of his persona, without the specific performance of certainty that had made him the emblem of a particular idea of American manhood, simply present in the room as the person he was underneath the icon, holding the weight of something he had not allowed himself to hold before. He reached out. He picked up Trumbo's letter. He held it without opening it. After a long time, he said, "I'd like to read this." "Not here, later." Douglas said, "It's yours." "I've had it long enough." Carson looked at both men. He said gently, "Can we ask what happens now?" Wayne looked at Douglas. Then he said something that the audio engineers had to boost in post-production because it was barely above a whisper, though every person in that silent studio heard it perfectly. He said, "I don't know if I can undo what I was part of." Douglas said, "No, you can't," Wayne said, "but I can stop pretending I was right about it." Douglas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, you can do that. That's different from nothing." The studio audience applauded. Not immediately, not reflexively. The applause built the way genuine responses build. From one person deciding, then two, then the room tipping into it, until the sound filled the space in the specific way that a room fills with something, when it has been holding its breath for a very long time, and the moment to release finally arrives. Carson allowed it. He did not redirect, did not speak over it, did not inject the professional pivot that would have returned the broadcast to safer ground. He let the room have what it needed to have. He had made a judgment call 17 minutes ago to not redirect a conversation that was heading somewhere he could not see, and the judgment had produced this, which was not entertainment, and was not a talk show segment, and was not the kind of television he had been making for 13 years. It was something closer to what television could be, when it stopped trying to be what television was, and allowed something true to happen in the space it created. He had made the right call. The broadcast ran 41 minutes over its scheduled runtime. Nobody complained. The NBC switchboard, by the time the East Coast feed ended, was overwhelmed in a way that the operators described as unprecedented in their experience of the show's history. The calls were not from people who thought what had happened was good television. They were from people who had watched two men have a conversation that most people never managed to have, about the things they had done that they could not undo, about the difference between knowing something and being willing to say it, about the specific mercy that comes when someone says to you, not that you are forgiven, because some things cannot be forgiven, but that your ability to stop pretending is different from nothing. John Wayne took the letter. He kept it in his study at his home in Newport Beach. He never spoke publicly about what was in it, beyond what had been revealed on that stage. But people who visited him in his final years, in the period between the cancer's return and his death in June of 1979, described the letter as something he returned to. It was not on display. It was not framed. It was in a drawer of his desk, folded the same way Douglas had carried it for 14 years, worn at the creases from being unfolded and read. Kirk Douglas, when asked about the broadcast in later years, was careful to say that what had happened on that stage was not a resolution. It was a beginning of honesty, not a conclusion of it. He said that Wayne had said that night, the hardest thing he had ever heard a man of Wayne's generation and Wayne's convictions say in public, which was that he had been wrong, and that the wrongness had consequences, and that he could stop pretending. He said that was not absolution. He said it was something, though, and something, he said, was the only currency that actually circulated between people who had lived through that history and were trying to find a way to occupy the same space without the weight of what they had done to each other becoming the only thing in the room. Johnny Carson spoke about that night once, in a private conversation that was later shared with a small number of people who had known him. He said it was the only broadcast in 13 years where he had genuinely not known, at any point during the 40 minutes, what was going to happen next. He said that not knowing had been terrifying, and that the result had been the best thing the show had ever done. He said he had learned something from that night about the difference between a host's job and a witness's job, and that the witness's job was sometimes more important, and that he had spent too long confusing the two. He said that what Kirk Douglas had put on that desk and what John Wayne had picked up was not a letter. It was a question that had been waiting 14 years for the right room to be asked in, and all he had done, he said, was not get out of the way. He had stayed in his chair and let the room do what rooms can sometimes do, when you stop trying to manage them, and let the people in them say what they actually came to say. If this story moved you, I want to ask you to do something before this video ends. There are conversations in your life that have been waiting 14 years. There are things that have been